Yeah, just make sure it works. Should work. Just thinking that loud.
Are we on here? Testing, testing.
Hello? Oh, there we go.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you, everyone, for coming. We're very excited and grateful today to be welcoming Dr. Alan Davis back to Ann Arbor to present this two-part lecture and workshop on clinical and academic skills for a career in psychedelic medicine. The first part of the event is going to go from about 2 to 3:30, and then at 3:30 we're going to have food come out, and we'll take a little break from about 3:30 to 4. And then following the break, the workshop on psychedelic experiences, psychotherapy will run from approximately 4 to 6 p.m. And there's coffee and water in the back right now if anybody needs any refreshments, so feel free to have those. And I'll just say a few words before we get going here. This event is being put on through 2 different student organizations on campus. The first one is SAPS, or the Student Association for Psychedelic Studies. And that organization is based out of the School of Social Work. And the other group is PN&T, so Psychedelic Neuroscience Therapy. And that group is based out of the U of M Medical School. And we're really happy today to be able to bring together members from both of these groups in an effort to increase interdisciplinary collaboration of psychedelic-related studies here in Michigan. So this is a really great thing for us. And thank you everyone again for coming. And we'd also like to thank the Rackham Graduate School and Rackham Student Government for providing funding to make this event. So now I can introduce our speaker today, Alan Davis. And Alan is no stranger to Ann Arbor. He actually completed a postdoctoral fellowship here at U of M. And that was in the Addiction Center in the Department of Psychiatry in 2016. And he was also one of our invited speakers for the Psychedelic Neuroscience and Therapy Symposium that happened last September. Currently, he's an assistant professor at the College of Social Work at Ohio State University, but I think he's still a fan of Michigan football. We invited him for a football game, and he cheers for Michigan, so that's good. And he's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit at Johns Hopkins University. His clinical expertise includes providing evidence-based treatments such as that's okay. Sorry.
Spoiler alert.
His clinical expertise includes providing evidence-based treatments such as motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. Consistent with his clinical interests, his research interests and expertise focus on contributing to the knowledge of and ability to help those suffering with substance use and mental health problems. Understanding how to improve clinical outcomes through examining new treatments, and developing ways to conceptualize substance use and mental health problems through a strengths-based approach. Psychedelic research focuses on clinical trials with psilocybin for people with depression and exploring psychological mechanisms by which psilocybin improves mental health and functioning. And again, we're very excited to have Alan joining us here today. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Davis.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, and it's always a treat and honor to come back to the University of Michigan. I am a Michigan fan, but I also think Ann Arbor is one of the best places I've ever lived, so, and that includes my current home of Columbus, so thank you for having me. It's an intriguing proposition, this type of workshop, and I like that we're doing this in two sections. So the first part of my talk today, I created to, I think, more as like a interactional lecture. So I view kind of the next hour and 15 or 20 minutes of our lives together in this space as one where I really want to invite you to be thinking critically about some things, but also to engage in some activities and some dialogue. So consider this kind of walking into a classroom as opposed to walking into a formal scientific talk. The concepts that I'll be talking about this first part of the day are things that have come up over the last several years in my own work in psychedelic research, but also things that have emerged even more recently as I've become more and more aware of some of the critical needs in developing a trajectory in this field. So there haven't really been a whole lot of clear paths for how one becomes a psychedelic researcher or a psychedelic clinician. And to to the large extent, those aren't necessarily going to be defined anytime soon. There's still a lot of question as to how that will take shape. So hopefully this first section today is a chance for you to explore what are some of the things that might be useful to you as you try to find whatever career you're looking for. As everything, my thoughts and ideas on this topic do not just solely live inside of me. These thoughts and ideas have taken shape within the context of a much larger team. Some of the team is represented on that slide. My close friends and colleagues at Johns Hopkins in our psilocybin research center, as well as other folks who are around the country working in different environments, including students at the University of Wisconsin, Imperial College London, and Maastricht University. I highlight the collaborative nature of this team because nothing has happened in isolation, and it wouldn't be because of me that these things happen. It's really because of these connections. And I should note that although nothing is funding this specific talk, I do have and have recently had funding from NIDA, as well as some private investors for our center at Johns Hopkins. So these are the things that I would like to talk about for the first hour and 15 minutes or so today. Each of these words that you see on the screen are things that I think are really critical to my own development in my professional world, and also I think will become more and more critical as the professional trajectories take shape in psychedelic research, certainly in academic settings, but as things become available to people post-FDA approval, which I'm speaking very confidently of, even though it's still a question. As things become more available to people and as more career opportunities come up for individuals in this field, I think that these questions and these words will become even more important. Not only important for individuals to grapple with and try to make sense of in their own work, but also for our combined fields and interdisciplinary fields to grapple with and come to some kind of consensus around. For example, what does it mean to start a professional discipline with competing values and competing interests? And so these things are very much alive and kicking in the research world right now, and certainly in the burgeoning clinical world. They're definitely becoming more and more important. So what the heck is going on right now? I assume that most of you in this room probably know most of what's going on right now, but I thought I would start off with just a quick video that highlights some of that.
That does happen sometimes, but in many more cases, these are drugs that can make you sane or more sane. If you ask people about what psychedelics or LSD, they're going to think about Timothy Leary, this flamboyant psychology professor, studying psilocybin and LSD, and then telling everybody they should take it.
I'm very glad to be discredited. I don't want credibility. I want incredibility.
The drugs kind of escape the laboratory and were embraced by the counterculture. and proved to be very disruptive to society. So you had this full-scale moral panic that eventually doomed the research. But what people don't know is that that 60s episode was really one small chapter in a much longer. Psychedelic drugs of one kind or another have been used by different societies for thousands of years. If you compare mental health care with any other branch of medicine, infectious disease, radiology, oncology, there have been very few achievements. Mental health treatment has not lengthened human life. So we need some new thinking. We need some new ideas. And psychedelics may well be that. There's a really exciting field of research underway, especially psilocybin, an ingredient. To help people deal with mental illness, addiction, depression, obsession, and the fear and anxiety that surrounds criminal diagnosis. And the feeling among the scientists is that these chemicals allow us to essentially reboot the brain. All those kind of deep grooves that lock us into patterns of both thought and behavior are dissolved and temporarily suspended in a way that allows us to break those patterns. We're now in a different world. The adults now, many of them have experience of psychedelics. They're not going to react in such a panicky way. Many of the people in charge of our institutions, probably regulators at the FDA, people at the American Psychiatric Association, they have personal experience of psychedelics, and they're, I think, going to bring a more rational attitude toward this. And I learned that there is a thriving underground of psychedelic therapists. These are serious professionals, but they're doing something legal. And I was able to find my way into this community. And after interviewing several of them, I found a couple of people I felt comfortable enough to entrust my mind to. This isn't doctors giving you a pill and sending you out. You are, for a period of 4 or 5 hours, in a room that's decorated like a kind of cozy den or study. You're lying down on a couch. You have eye shades on and headphones, which are playing a very carefully curated playlist to make you go inside, to have an internal experience. And you're with 2 guides at all times. Some people are...
Sorry. Well, I think my main point is already clear, which is Michael Pollan's book coming out a few years ago. And the reason why I start off with that video today is because that was really where I see things shifting in our culture around this topic. And the way it shifted for me personally was it was after that book came out that my grandfather, who was a very old, I think very old, very old and very conservative and very, very, very Republican person in my life, actually called me and said, well, I want to talk about psychedelics. And I was like, I don't know if I'm prepared to have this conversation with you. But it was the first time that I think a lot of conversations were happening in homes and in families, in places in our culture where those conversations probably hadn't been happening. And so it was a seminal moment for me in my personal. But I think professionally, since that book came out, we have seen more and more interest in psychedelic research, more and more people interested in this type of profession, and certainly an explosion of people who are trying to seek getting into the trials and getting help with the problems. And I think that's only going to continue to expand and grow over the next couple of years. So where do you want to go? I ask this question because I think there are a lot of people who see kind of very few trajectories available to them right now. But one of the ways that I think we can start to think about and envision what a post-approval and post-hopefully decriminalization landscape looks like for psychedelics is starting to think about what are the multiple possible ways that you can contribute. Research is one of the more primary ways right now, although clinical things are building up with things like ketamine treatment and hopefully expanded access through MAPS with MDMA therapy will hopefully open up more doors for clinicians. But there are a lot of other types of things that we're going to need established, both in communities, local communities, as well as the larger culture, that can really enhance the capacity for certainly our predominantly Western culture to try to make some kind of sense of these experiences. I think that trajectory is really critical for any of it to work, frankly. There's a lot of hurdles for the scientific end of things to actually be made available to the public, but once it is made available, we are certainly not prepared yet to handle the types of things that will come up when people start to access this type of treatment and start to access this type of healing, and then go back into the same communities and families where these problems in a lot of ways originated. So there needs to be education for family members, there needs to be education and training for communities, and we need to build the community infrastructure needed for this type of work, let alone the professional training that will be required for the clinical focus and for the many disciplines that are currently underrepresented in this work to begin to do their research as well to better understand some of these topics. What do you want to do? What is your passion? These are questions that I struggled with when I was initially getting interested in this topic, in part because I had the answers to these questions. I knew what my passion was. I knew what I wanted to do, but I had no idea how I was going to get there. But it was critical, especially when I was here at the University of Michigan, to continue to focus on what it was that was driving me to be curious about this work. What was it that was interesting? What was it that I saw as a potential? Because there were a lot of roadblocks. There was a lot of people around saying, this is not attainable. This was about 5 years ago, before Michael Pollan's book came out, before a lot of the seminal cancer studies were published, and pretty much everyone in my professional world, as a graduate student in psychology, pretty much everyone was telling me that this was a huge risk, and you risk kind of ruining your career trajectory by pursuing this. But I think connecting to passion and connecting to what I knew was meaningful to me helped enable me to persist in pursuing the things that were important. What are your personal values? I think that going forward in this, and I'm just going to use the word the field, but I think already that's kind of an interdisciplinary term in this area. But in terms of whether it's research or clinical things, knowing what your personal values are, identifying what they are, understanding who you are as a person will help you with any of those trajectories. Coming into contact with discrepancies between the things that you value, the things that you're pursuing, and the things that might be going on around you, including the multiple competing interests in society right now, where there are certainly a lot of burgeoning financial interests in this field, and also other personal interests in pursuing this, will help people to, I hope, it's helped me at least, to find the strength within, to kind of come back to a place that is very safe and secure in terms of what you're pursuing and how you might make decisions when the challenging things come up. But also understanding what your professional values are. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and in that training, we're kind of, the word indoctrinated comes to mind, but that wasn't the word I was initially going to use. We're talked about, we talk about professional values, we talk about what the values are for our profession, but what are the values for the psychedelic profession? What are the values going to be for clinicians in psychedelic spaces? What are the values going to be for researchers in these spaces? How are those values different or inconsistent with the values that you might have personally? So one thing that I would like to do as a little exercise is I want everyone to, as looking at this non-exhaustive list, although there's a lot of options up there, pick out a couple. You may already know the answer to this question, you may already know your values, but I just want you to pick out 2 to 3 values that you see on the screen, both personal values as well as professional values. If you have a paper or pen, you can write them down, but just see if any of these words kind of speak to you as something that guides your personal or professional life in kind of how you've been pursuing those things. And as you settle on a couple of words, I just really like everyone to take a minute. Close your eyes if that's comfortable to you, once you have identified the words that are important to you. And just take a couple deep breaths. And I'd like you to imagine that value or those values that you identify. And I want you to think about why it's important to you. What is it about those values that is meaningful? Maybe it was because of things that have happened in your past or things that you want to happen in your future. Maybe these are values that are ingrained in your communities and your families, or your friendships, or your profession. Think about the ways in which these values have guided all of your decisions up to this point, even including why you're here and interested in this topic. What I'd like you to do is open your eyes and take a minute or two with the people at your table, maybe 2 or 3 people at your table, and just share with those people what your values are, maybe 1 each, and talk about why it's important to you. So if you haven't had a chance yet to hear everyone's value, then take the next minute to wrap up. Or has a shared issue. All right, so I'll start off, but I'd like to then invite anyone who wants to also be a part of the dialogue. My personal and professional values happen to be the same. I don't think that has to be the case, but as I've explored this topic in my own life, I've found that's true. And also then I required the foundation that I started to also have those values. But it's connection and inspiration. I feel as though my primary value in life is connection, both through the professional work that I do, not only research, but also teaching and service work as the thing that kind of guides and orients my decisions in those. And also inspiration. So it's probably not surprising that I found myself in academia because I enjoy working with students and also kind of inspiring them to pursue things they're passionate about. But I'd love to hear from some of you about the conversation that took place at your table or some of the things that are valuable to you, professionally or personally. Yeah.
My name is Danielle. I'm a social worker. My personal values were appreciation. Was pretty much translate over, but I added a couple others for professional. That was advocacy.
Thank you. Who else would like to share?
My name's Chris. I'm a pharmacist. My big one was safety. Dosing is super important in my career, so we have to make sure a patient comes taking care of their needs first. So that was pretty much one of my number ones. The whole list is amazing. Hard to pick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no wrong answer, right? I'm just curious, is that both a personal and professional value?
Yeah.
Yeah. You find that in both parts of your life.
Yeah.
What else is valuable to people in the room? Great, yeah, fun's a good one. It's also, at least for me, one of the harder ones to prioritize. It's certainly professionally, but super meaningful and important. Others? Yeah.
Two of my personal for advocacy and versatility. Advocacy just because I really enjoy talking about different stigmas and learning to break them down and go from a judgmental perspective to a how can I help perspective. And I think that's why like pharmacological freedom and the idea of versatility is interesting to me because there are a lot of different people and everybody's different and treatments that work for some people may not work for others. And I think that the field of psychedelics is a good example of that.
Great, thank you. Any others that want to be shared that people feel they want to put out in the room? Yeah.
Accountability.
Accountability.
Helping that you, those around you. That's the trick.
Yeah. Absolutely. Accountable to whom?
Accountable to the community.
Yeah. I think that's a really great one. I was thinking recently I was watching, it might have been a TED Talk or something, but someone was describing some research where they've correlated the kind of rise over the last several decades of mental health problems in the United States. And apparently it's correlated pretty highly with the amount of square footage that people in the United States have increasingly in for themselves. And it's not a surprise to me that as we get more disconnected from communities and disconnected from other humans, that we also can see some of these difficulties come up. So I like the accountability component because we're not only accountable to ourselves and our families, we're also accountable for others. We're accountable for people that we don't even know. And I think this work in particular starts to highlight some of the ways in which we can show up and be accountable for people. So, are your personal and professional values the same? Or are they different? For me, they're the same. Not everyone has that, and that's okay. I think that the reason this comes up as something critical as you're figuring out whatever path you're going to take in this work is that, at least in my experience, there are times where decisions have to take place where your professional and personal values may come into contact with other people's professional interests. So one example of this right now is kind of as the capitalistic framework of Western culture kind of starts to take hold and invest in the types of opportunities that this medical field will enable, there are some ways in which that may or may not be consistent with your personal values. They may be consistent with the overall values of society, but there's also a lot of question about whether that should be the case. I have a lot of friends and colleagues who work in different types of psychedelic spaces who would argue that that's the whole point of having any of this available to people to begin with, is that we're trying to dismantle some of these systems and certainly is trying to dismantle the ways in which these systems can co-create things like oppression, institutionalized racism, violence, and other things. So how do you both engage in this field in a way that can create an income for yourself, at the same time trying to be mindful of the types of things that will pull you into the system that is still the predominant system in our culture? So one of the ways that this comes up, in my work is certainly the people who want to put money into research studies. We've certainly had a lot of notoriety recently at Hopkins because of some investments that have occurred both from nonprofit foundations as well as individuals. And there is a trade-off and a balance there of, who will you accept money from? What types of capital and investment is worthwhile to pursue because it will enable your mission and it will enable your professional goals, while at the same time balancing the challenges that come along with that type of decision. And that's not going to just happen at large universities with lots of research investment. That's going to, I think, continue to grow in smaller spaces, in local communities, in clinic investment, in developing retreat centers, and developing new academic programs to train clinicians and to train other folks who want to do this kind of work. So having an understanding of where your values are and how those might or might not align with the types of industry that you're engaging with might be a really important piece of the puzzle in deciding when to accept opportunities and when to turn them down. I'm not the best yet at learning when to say no. I just never got that message in the 80s, I guess. But I'm trying to figure this out as I go. Is your professional or academic life consistent with your values? So separate from the way in which opportunities may come that could create a situation of inconsistency, there are a lot of ways in which you might just discover that situations you're already in are more or less consistent with those values. The more personal work that you do or things that you explore internally with your values, but certainly also kind of your professional trajectories, you might discover there are people around you that are not consistent, or there are activities a part of what you're doing that are inconsistent. What do? One of the biggest things that we hear reported from the people in the clinical trials where we administer psilocybin is that they get a lot of new insight into things that in their life. They discover new awareness around perhaps a relationship that isn't serving them. We've also had several people who come out of these sessions who describe that their work life, their occupation is not consistent, and they realize that that has a big influence on their mental health. And yet, those are really difficult things to change for some people. Not everybody has the same access to being able to change their job just because they have this type of insight. And I think that as we arrive into a professional discipline where we can kind of have the luxury and the opportunity to co-create what this looks like as a field, then I think it's also partially our responsibility at this stage to understand what those things that we're bringing into these professional environments. How are we going to act differently? How are we going to support the people in those environments when they have new discoveries about themselves, or when they realize that something is no longer consistent, or now it's inconsistent with who they are or where they want to go? I don't think that our current system does a very good job at adapting and flexing and flowing with these types of discoveries. And yet, here we are trying to produce a medicine into the world that is specifically changing the ways in which people understand what their interests are and who they want to be. So for that to work, I think, we also need to figure out, how does occupation flex and flow? How do we as community members and coworkers flex and flow to recognize that humans are constantly evolving to discover new things about themselves, especially in a situation where psychedelic medicines are present? Are you called to be of service? I know a lot of people who are pursuing this work because they feel called to be of service to people with mental health problems, certainly in the clinical and research world, but there's a lot of other ways to be called to service. There's individuals who are working in peer support or harm reduction circles, who are trying to help people on the ground who are using psychedelics or other substances as personal, I don't like the word recreation, personal exploration. And that's a really critical piece of this puzzle as well. You know, even though I work kind of staunchly in the medicalization area, I also believe that we need to decrease the types of harms that are occurring for people who choose to experience these things on their own. And that type of cognitive liberty and the people who are working in that space also need to have rights and availability to have their service acknowledged and have that as also in kind of equal voice at the table as we co-create this field together. What does service look like? Who is it for? How is it enacted? In research settings, there are a lot of, as some of you probably know yourself, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of ways in which the things that you're called to be of service for get altered or diluted through the course of getting a study up and running. That also happens in clinical practice. Trying to enact a mission is great, but when you have to deal with managed care who tells you what you are not going to be compensated for, can start to change and alter the ways in which you provide services. Now, that's not necessarily true in every case. Some people are willing to kind of continue fighting the good fight, but sometimes there just isn't fight to be had, and you have to either put food on the table or you have to not. And so how do we engage in that process? How do we decide what service is a priority, which service is going to be something that is a deal breaker that we have to provide or we have to engage in, or which community are we going to prioritize over other communities? I don't think there's anything wrong with people having a strong interest in a certain population or a certain community, but how those decisions are made and how we prioritize who has access and the rights to engage with those communities, I think needs to be a piece of the conversation. And certainly in this culture, we have a lot of different communities, a lot of underrepresented communities currently right now in this space. And we need to continue the conversation and dialogue around increasing the representation in this field. So this question was something that was presented to me. I did forget to say this at the beginning, but Dr. Alicia Danforth was kind of the person in my life during this trajectory that started to prompt my asking some of these questions. And I say that because I want to make another point of showing how these don't just happen in isolation. They happen with guidance, they happen with people that I look up to. But this is one of the questions that she asked me the first time that she met me was, why do you want to do this? What's the purpose? Why do you want to engage in psychedelic research for me? But there are also other avenues here. And at the time, the only answer I could come up with is that, well, I want to help. I want to help the people that I see suffering. I was in clinical psychology program. I was working in mental health clinics. Actually, at the time, I was working at the Ann Arbor VA, working in the trauma and substance use disorder world. And I wanted to help the veterans that I saw weren't getting the help they needed. And yes, that I think is an honorable mission, but it didn't take account some of the, I think, darker sides of some of the things that are in this field right now. And one of the questions that she followed up with was, do you want to be a psychedelic rock star? Her term. And at first I thought, no, I don't want to be a rock star. What does that mean? And she really pushed me to consider what piece of my interest in this work is because of my ego. There's a lot of ways in which an academic trajectory can reinforce kind of egoism. But in the psychedelic space, certainly a couple of years ago, but probably even more so now, there are people who have a lot of power and have a lot of voice and have a lot of quote-unquote fame in this work. And there are some people, in my experience, that I've come into contact with who are pursuing this type of work because of the possibility of having that notoriety, of having that voice and having that position in this community, especially because the community is not fully formed. There's a lot of opportunity for people to have control and to have power and to have that voice. And so her prompting of this question for me started a several-year journey inside myself of trying to understand what was my contribution that I wanted, what was the piece of me that was looking for kind of being the person that gets invited to the University of Michigan on a Tuesday, what part of me is being reinforced by that, and how am I going to keep that in check as I progress in this field? How am I going to continue to have this conversation with myself in order to come back to what those values are and who I am and what I'm looking for in this work, and how is that related to how I'm being called to be of service? Being called to be of service does not mean that your ego is gone in that pursuit, right? And certainly for this field, I think it helps all of us as we co-create this space to understand at what degree our ego is contributing to our desire to work in this field. And because on that topic, we're going to show another video. This time I'm going to turn the internet on.
So when you think about that privilege, you think about that access, you have these non-Indigenous people, Indigenous, and then because they learn something over there, there's a word for those kind of people that do that kind of thing. They then take that and go, oh, that's what they're doing over there too, so let's just apply that. Instead of saying, hi, local Indigenous community, ask how you identify yourselves. The concept. So I get a little flustered when I see that word Native American shaman, because our communities have doctors, our communities have healers, our communities have medicine people, our communities have our two-spirited community, which two-spirit is a way to identify those who bring that balance to the masculine and feminine that doesn't belong on the binary, well, it's not a polarized of the binary plane existence, but it's also a spiritual sacred connection. So some community members may say, oh, that's just the Native American version of the LGBTQ community. And not fully, there's a little bit more responsibility in it.
Sometimes I see people say like, oh, this kind of queer concept is very westernized and this is not from Africa, this is not in Asia. But we know that in Asia, in Africa, in many cultures, we have queer people. So I just think that being a queer people is not the same in every culture, but you cannot invisibilize these people. So it's not because the winners of what is a traditional culture are not queer, that there are not queer people there. So we have to really balance that.
So in this training that we'll do, that I helped a long time ago, there's a section on it where where we kind of break down. But then there's a section where people say what these different things. But again, those sayings in that language, they're usually like things that you would. My take on it is that it is colonialism that made those words. That's my process.
When you start to see how you are a white privileged person, and I can tell you, being an educated and really well-off black person, I'm moving around with white privilege too. I have a sense of entitlement for sure, that I can travel the world and do this work and speak at these conferences, which is the kind of evolution of, to me, the white privilege thing, which is basically just that I think now white privilege is almost equated to consumerism, capitalism / democracy, right? Which has been exported all over the world. So as an American person, regardless of your color, to some degree, you're kind of moving through the world on this magic carpet of white privilege. If you are someone that goes to, South American studies for 3 or 4 weeks in the shaman back, and you're suddenly wearing shamanic outfit, to people clothing and jewelry and speaking the language, you're deciding to have your friends over and you're doing equal, okay, that's definitely appropriate. If you're really appropriating something that you don't have either permission to use or have earned, let's say, the right. That's very different than someone who is really sincerely interested in what we call the medicine. Right? You've been really turned on by, let's say, ayahuasca. You want to bring this to your family, your friends, or to the world in general. You go and you sit, you study, and at some point, typically it's what happens in these traditions with indigenous people. They couldn't tell, the healer they're working with will say, yeah, I think you can research. That's not appropriation, right? That's literally what I would just call an adaptation or evolution.
I've had to inspect that conversation around appropriation. And what I consistently keep seeing in all the plant teachers is that the situation on the planet Earth right now is dire, that it needs more people serving the medicine. Now, how do I feel specifically about white male shaman doing work? If you have not done your ancestral karma cleansing work around the global genocide of Black and brown people, and you are serving the medicine, that is absolutely wrong. That is, it's horrible. It is causing harm again.
I am very afraid of the extractive dimension of capitalism as it gets involved with psychedelics, not just in terms of extracting the materials, frankly, the extraction experience. But we got to remember that like all that data is going in there, and what they're getting is a much finer picture of the far out edges of the human mind and how it operates. And that becomes an object of study. It becomes something that moves for-profit companies. You know, people are looking into when things are going to be stressful. People are going to be looking at escapes. There's going to be drugs or drug technologies that allow, you know, control systems to stimulate and kind of gauge human consciousness and human experience. So that's a whole other kind of dimension. In some sense, we're just seeing the beginning of some of those deeper, to some degree, darker implications of psychedelic renaissance.
I just want to give a quick shout out to Shakruna. I think they're bringing some interesting voices to a microphone that so far haven't been given as much place in this field as the researchers who are doing the work. What this video I think highlights for me and why I showed it to you today is because I have frequently asked myself the question through my clinical training, where it's kind of been incumbent upon me in that process to explore the ways in which my culture and identity is different than other people's, and understanding the types of people that I might work with in clinical settings. It's been really important for me to explore topics around white privilege and the types of access and power that I have because of the color of my skin. I also happen to share kind of an intersection of an identity because I'm also a queer man, and that identity also confers stigma associated with it. However, the color of my skin seems to, in almost every situation, confer more power and privilege than I have removed from me, especially because of my male sex. So these topics are something that I've been kind of personally exploring and professionally exploring, but I think in the psychedelic discipline, certainly in research, it's really critical at this time point that we can open up these dialogues to people, especially as people want to find a trajectory into this field. So I encourage everyone sitting here right now, or everyone who hears this on our video, to start asking themselves these questions that we're going to start exploring. What is power and privilege in psychedelic spaces? Who has that power and privilege right now, and who is trying to access more of it? Who should have access? And who has the responsibility to make sure that that access is opening up? Are you a conduit of power? This is something that I struggled with quite a great deal when I first accepted the position at Johns Hopkins. I was really grateful for the opportunity to go there and to study and to find a path for myself professionally. And I was also acutely aware that I was in some ways kind of walking into the lion's den in terms of power, certainly in the United States, but even globally. And as a white man, separate from my queerness, I recognized that there was a conflict there of the ways in which I felt comfortable or uncomfortable kind of accessing that power. So what I did is I started to think about the ways that I could find a conduit inside of my experience that tried to dispel and create space for that power to reach other people who didn't necessarily have that same opportunity. That ultimately led to the creation of Source Research Foundation, which I'll talk about a little bit later today. It's an organization that provides grants to students who want to study psychedelics. We're also going to, hopefully this year, open up a community grants program to help empower people in communities to create spaces that are psychedelic friendly in their local communities, things like integration circles, art installations, speakers, and those. And so that was my way of using that power to try to create change in this world. There are a lot of ways that could happen. It doesn't have to be something as kind of that mission. That was just my own. But I think that thinking about how do you take the power that you're getting in this world, how do you take that and share it with others? How do you create a sense of a conduit inside of your being that can then increase the access and availability to people? Who is responsible? So one of the things that I think we need to figure out in this field is who is responsible for taking these topics and making change. How do we change the accessibility and availability of psychedelic medicines? Who is responsible for that? Right now, I think, at least in my experience, there's a lot of people that are just pointing fingers and saying, well, it's not our responsibility, someone else needs to be working on that. I think it's all of our responsibility. So whatever your interest is in this work and whatever career you find yourself in or the ways in which your personal life interacts with this field, I think this is a really important question for thinking about how are you going to go about doing that? Are you a piece of that responsibility? And if you are, then what ways can you engage in that responsibility in your local community? Who is responsible for increasing academic opportunities? Now, I firmly believe that it should be the people working in academic spaces, but there are a lot of people in those spaces who are having a difficult time just kind of creating their own career and completing the jobs and the research studies and the tasks and in terms of teaching and mentoring. It's really difficult to step outside of that process and consider things that you need to do in addition to that. And so I think that we can also try to find ways in a consumeristic market, which education and academia absolutely is, for students to stand up and say what they want. So it's really great to be here at the University of Michigan with the student organizations that are really working on this kind of as a grassroots effort to create the type of space in this university where more people can get this type of information, and that can hopefully lead to more opportunities in the future for students who want to come here because that exists. If it doesn't exist, if the conversations aren't happening, then people aren't necessarily going to feel safe and supported in their own exploration of that academically. And so I think that needs to continue to expand here at the university, but of course at other universities and in the community. What are your duties? So one of the things that those of you in any professional discipline, certainly the helping professions, medicine, psychology, social work, those professions typically have a set of laws and also ethical principles that come along with defining what you are beholden to in your profession. What are the things that you are required to do, for example, to keep people safe? So as a psychologist, I have certain duties to ensure that if I learn of a child being harmed, for example, that I have duties to enact to make sure that that child is safe, whether that's reporting the situation, et cetera. And so those duties are really critical, I think, to the professional identity and to enacting that profession. What are those duties going to be in psychedelic medicine? This is a very unique field because it's going to be comprised of multiple disciplines, including, hopefully, an integration of those disciplines into community. How are we going to co-create the dialogue around what those duties will be? How are we going to enact social sanctions to people that we discover are engaging inappropriately in that space? How are we going to hold them accountable? In what ways are we going to govern who has professional access to be a professional doing this kind of work? Or should we even have that to begin with? I mean, it's kind of to me, it seems like a necessity, but maybe it's not. Maybe that won't be how this field evolves. Who has duties to humanity in this field? We're talking about providing a substance, certainly in a medical standpoint, but also in other hopeful future places where these substances are not prohibited. We're talking about giving very powerful experiences to people who haven't had a very recent lineage of understanding and incorporating those types of experiences. What is our duty to those people to make sure that we can help them through those experiences, to discover the things that they're going to discover and the ways in which they can make sense out of those experiences? And what are your duties to other professionals in this field? How do you make space for multiple different viewpoints that are really critical to engaging not only a clinical and a medical dialogue, but also one where certain professions don't necessarily need to be higher or lower in terms of clout or influence than other professions? I keep coming back to this idea of integration because not only is that word kind of colloquially used in this space, but also because I think it's really critical. Most of the patients that are coming out of psilocybin sessions that I've worked with talk about a deep connection and integration of themselves into not only the communities that they come from, the families that they're in, but also the universe, the world, nature. And if we're going to bring about these types of experiences through the use of psilocybin or other psychedelics, then we can't simply ignore those messages in the way that we engage professionally or personally. I think we need to create a professional space that will enable that same type of integration and connection to occur. And this last one, what are your responsibilities as a clinician, a researcher, or as a community member to that process? What I'd like to do is to do another exercise. So I'd like you to break up into your table groups again to talk about these things. I'm going to provide two different scenarios that I would like you to talk about how you would handle these situations as they came up in your professional world. So recently, these are both real situations that have happened recently. I was emailed from a person who had recently discovered that their friend did a session, a psychedelic session, with an apparently irresponsible practitioner. Those were the words that they used. And they said their friend was in a state of mania. Those, again, quoted words. And ever since the session ended about 2 weeks ago, had been in this constant state of mania. They had also, because of that manic episode, attempted suicide, and then went to, their family took them to the emergency room. Medical doctors in that environment, according to this person, wanted to prescribe antipsychotics and were kind of considering a whole host of medical diagnoses because of what they were reporting. Now, keep in mind, I'm sitting in my little office at Ohio State University answering emails to students who are in my class, and I get this email. What is my responsibility getting this email from a complete stranger that I don't know, but who happened to know that my name was connected to this topic? Their friend happened to get a substance that I had published a study providing evidence about, found my email on the internet, and emailed me. So I'd just like you to think about what you would do if you showed up to work or you opened up your laptop at home and had this email. What's your response? What do you do? So take about 4 or 5 minutes and talk with the people at your table about different approaches that you would take in that situation. Yeah. I'm really So take about a minute to wrap up your conversation. Exactly. So, right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. All right, let's come back to the virtual group. So I'd like to hear from some of you about what your group talked about. How would you approach to in your specific profession or personally? What you do? Yeah, no, that's a great response. I think there are a lot of questions here, right? Not only about maybe individual response based on your profession or your approach to this type of issue. In general, there's not a lot of information, right? And so certainly there's questions that need to be perhaps asked, to clarify what even could be done or what advice or direction could be given. Other thoughts? Yeah. Right, so if there was like a place where they could be kind of connected to people who understand those types of situations, and they can maybe be more directly involved with the process of. Yeah.
Our group thought it was important to acknowledge that in a lot of these, as a result of a lack of integration, but it can also be a legitimate psychosis that was triggered by this.
Right, and depending on which side of it you kind of come from in your maybe your kind of personal thoughts about the topic or your professional understanding and expertise, those are two very different responses, right? Yeah, certainly the way that it seemed in the email was this person thought it was probably related to the psychedelic or lack of integration, but they don't necessarily know that to be true, right? They're assuming that to be true maybe because of their own perspective. Absolutely. Other thoughts?
Worried about we were like how to become sorry you're having and invest time and energy in all these.
Thank you for the compassion. I will say, just to give you a sense of it, I get emails like this pretty regularly now, and it's why I think so much about power and privilege, because this is also what comes along with creating a professional trajectory in a space. I think right now it's probably mostly happening to those of us who are publishing on the topic, but that will change when each of you stands up in your academic community or your personal community or your families as a representative of this field. I think most of you in this room will start getting questions and emails and phone calls asking you what should be done because they've come into a. And so that's why it's important to think about how will you respond? What is your go-to to make kind of decision? Luckily, as a clinical psychologist, or maybe unluckily in certain situations, I do have like a code of ethics that guides my professional decision making. Now, it's not always clear cut as to how I proceed, but it certainly can be helpful to have that code of ethics. However, in this situation, I'm also a licensed professional not working in the jurisdiction of where this person is living. So I can't really enact a professional response to this person. Not that I would anyway, given that I've not met the person, I'm only getting kind of secondhand information. But a response, in my opinion, was necessary and typically is necessary. My approach in this situation, I don't know whether it was right or wrong, but my approach was to provide resources to this person to respond and certainly validate their difficulty in this situation, and I tried to connect them with immigration resources in the community. Luckily, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but they lived in New York City, where there are quite a few resources for people who want to seek integration services or have kind of consulting clinicians in the area who they could connect with. But obviously that's not the case everywhere. There are pockets of it and there's more and more growing, but there's a lot of places in the country, in the world where that does not exist. So having things like online resources, knowing that there are websites out there that will list integration providers who can be contacted both to work with people via the web and over the phone or in those local communities can be really helpful to know so you can pass on those resources to other people. Let me do another example. So this was a phone call from someone concerned about their health. A facilitator offered to dose everyone in their local community with 5-MeO-DMT, which is a very potent and powerful psychedelic medicine. This person came to their community and did not provide any preparation for this experience, just started selling sessions to their friend group. There was no integration of the experience. They essentially dosed everyone in a day and then kind of left the community. The dosing was also uncontrolled from what they described. So on the phone, they said that this person was just kind of like throwing a bunch of 5-MeO-DMT into a vial and kind of just like passing it, kind of dosing. For any of you who understand what 5-MeO-DMT is, it's a horrible way to do that. Anxiety for this person started immediately after after the acute effects had worn off. That persisted for weeks. Now, luckily, this person reported on the phone that that community, at least, they kind of were having and they were trying to lean on each other. However, none of them really had the type of resources or understanding they needed to really kind of help work on these issues. And so after weeks of feeling traumatized and feeling very anxious, she went to the emergency department. I know both of these stories end up in the medical field, and I don't mean to stigmatize that process, but I feel like that's kind of the place where these things are kind of showing up most right now. So this person went to the ED and didn't feel comfortable sharing about the psychedelic use, but just shared about the feeling and anxiety that they were experiencing. And of course, the medical professionals are very busy in that setting, and they're likely to kind of rely on that information because that's what's being shared. And so they prescribed benzodiazepines for this person. As a result, that person has, at the time they called me, they had been on benzos daily for months. They tried to come off of the benzos a couple times on their own, but they were not able to. The minute they stopped taking them, they would have this really severe panic and anxiety come back. So what do you do? I'm not going to have you break up to talk about that one, but I think the response is probably pretty similar. But I was on the phone with this person. Not only is it an email situation, you can have time to think about it. You can have time to kind of maybe talk to other people that you trust about how they would approach it. But this person's on the phone. And so I, in this situation, did the same thing. I tried to reassure them and connect them to local resources. Unfortunately, all too often, I feel like that's my only course of action, is to try to connect them to resources. But also, I feel like because both of these situations were highlighting for me a direct relationship between the things that I was publishing in science, the things that I was interested in studying academically and publishing in the scientific and conference community, were the same substances that these people were coming into contact with. And in some ways, that whole kind of underground work that's being done to provide these substances to people, in part that kind of is growing because the more and more we're talking about it from a scientific perspective. And so also what I feel like is really critical is that I own that power and privilege, and I do something about it to advocate for the right kind of practices, the right types of safe things that should be done for people in non-clinical settings so that they are aware of the right kinds of things. Well, I say right, that's my bias. I think preparation and integration is right. But so that people know and understand what those things are. It's also why I'm going to talk about that in the second half today, talk about preparation and integration. What kinds of activities are really critical and important for not only getting ready for these kinds of experiences, but what to do after you have them. None of those things, I think, it kind of compares to some of these other big challenges that are going on right now. I also pretty regularly get contacted about people reporting sexual misconduct in underground and other community psychedelic spaces, things like physical abuse, neglect, as well as several deaths that have occurred because of inappropriate and unethical practices, in my opinion, for people providing these types of medicines without the right kinds of safety precautions. So I appreciate the compassion, but I also know that it's my responsibility. Like, I feel like I have to take both and be willing to dive into talking about these and exploring them and waiting for the rights of people who are at risk for experiencing things, and I hope that each of you do. So I thought I would just end our time together this half with a couple ways in which we could think about starting to orient our understanding of what's ethical, what we're kind of responsible for in psychedelic medicine. One way to do that is to look at some other professions who have done this or at least attempted to do this. And we can do that by looking at things like the values or the guiding principles of psychology. I'll also talk about social work. There are lots of examples of this, counseling, medicine, other types of disciplines. But it's a way to start thinking about how do we come back to deciding how to act? What can we rely on to help guide our decision making? Some of the general principles of psychology, things like striving to protect the rights and welfare of others, ensuring that others uphold high ethical standards, not just others in the community, but other professionals, kind of keeping tabs on what are the people around you doing, and are they acting ethically? Are they acting in ways that are serving things like autonomy of individuals and rights for people's bodies and voices? Not attempting to deceive or misrepresent not only your professional competence, but also the types of things that we know and the things that we don't know. One thing that I come into contact pretty regularly with right now are a lot of kind of burgeoning business in this area of psychedelic medicine who are trying to closely align what they're providing to what's been done in the scientific studies. That's all well and good, but so little has actually been done in scientific studies. There's so many more questions that we have answers to that there's times where I feel a little uncomfortable with promoting something that we don't necessarily know is right for every single person. But we don't yet know really who isn't right for it either, or what timeline they need to be right to have these types of experiences. Also being fair and impartial, looking towards the principle of justice, and also respecting the rights and dignity, the rights to dignity, privacy, and confidentiality. If we're going to have spaces where people are going to be vulnerable and to talk about things that are very difficult and also some very meaningful for them, then how are we going to co-create that safe space together, both in a professional setting and also in a personal setting? Social work also has some core values that, from a professional standpoint, could start to help guide some of these decision-making processes in our profession, this new profession. Things like service and social justice. How are we going to stand up and help people in need, at the same time challenge things that are contributing to injustice and a lack of access and availability of these types of treatments. Also respecting the dignity and worth of every person, whether it's a client or a stranger, a friend, but kind of standing up and connecting when we can. Recognizing the central importance of human relationships, that connection seems to be repeatedly the thing that's coming up and described, not only in these experiences, but in the integration of these experiences in people's lives. How are we going to tap into that to continue to co-create that together? Behaving in a trustworthy manner and practicing within our area of competence. That's particularly challenging right now because I don't really know that we have a clear set of what competence looks like in this field. Certainly, we're trying to figure that out. I'm certainly still trying to figure that out for myself. But knowing when you don't have the competence, when you're not yet equipped with the right skills or techniques in order to do the things that you think are necessary, then that should be your responsibility to figure that out. So I'll just kind of end with this. Are you prepared for a range of ethical dilemmas in the roles that you have or the roles that you want? How do your values inform your decision making? Will we create that in a professional society? Will we create this in an interdisciplinary community? Or will we have to rely on our personal and professional values to guide the ways that we make decisions? Do you have guidance from peers, professionals, leaders, maybe elders in your personal communities or in the psychedelic community? How are you going to reach out and get the support and guidance you need when these challenges come up? And who will you turn to? Who are the people in your life that you trust with this topic? That you trust their decision making or you trust their values and the way that they would approach it? I just wanted to highlight some of the students that I've been fortunate enough to connect to over the last couple of years. These are 9 students across a variety of disciplines. I mentioned Source Research Foundation earlier today, and this is the way that I'm enacting my value of connection and inspiration, and also acting as a conduit in the best way that I can. These students represent fields from clinical psychology to neuroscience, medicine, anthropology, both cultural and medical anthropology. We have a student from a Latinx studies program, and they're studying things from lots of different perspectives that are going to be critical for this field going forward. Our next application cycle, for those of you who are students and want to apply, is coming up this summer on June 1st. Applications are due. We're interested in both students here in the United States, certainly here at University of Michigan, but also if you know people abroad, we're accepting applications from international universities. And I'll leave it there with some pictures of some of the people in my life who have helped me craft this talk and some of these questions and conversations that we've been having together, including my dog Morty, who is responsible for all of it. Thank you. I'll take some questions. Yeah.
A couple of slides ago, you were talking about first and foremost, with the exception of Oregon and Washington, still a Schedule I drug, DEAs. So any type of urgent business is automatically felony distribution. So how, that being the number one first and foremost, how do you even talk about it being unethical, flat out illegal? So what kind of businesses would even come across your desk?
So one of the big ones are international locations where the legality is either questionable, as well as in a gray area of legality, or some places where it is legal. There are kind of increasingly large numbers of large is the right word, but increasing numbers of different types of centers and clinics that are starting up with a variety of different types of psychedelics and a variety of different types of professionals. There also are, I think, a lot of growing financial interest in what kind of venture capitalists see as a possibility in the United States and finding ways to kind of get into that process as early as possible in order to be ready to kind of hit the ground running when and if the FDA approves these medicines. So I think that there's some that's growing here, but more I was talking about the ones that are international where they're kind of already happening or being built right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
You dealt in research with outward using psychedelics for patients, kind of trials.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Were you just asking if I was familiar with those studies? Or? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say all of the research that happened in the 50s and 60s were kind of seminal in the creation of the Hopkins Research Laboratory, kind of creating the first kind of new age of psilocybin administration studies. They did lean pretty heavily, not only on the research from that time, but also on some practitioners. Bill Richards, who for many years was kind of the primary clinician at Hopkins, and kind of directed a lot of those initial studies in terms of getting the clinical components in place, was because of the work that he had done back in the 60s and early 70s at Spring Grove and other places running some of those studies. So I would say most of the psychedelic research in my little corner of the psychedelic research world is influenced pretty heavily by that past, or at least that recent past. All right, well, so I think we have a break now until 4. Oh, is there another question? Yes, hi.
You touched on the practices and what is going on healing for studies. And I was just curious if you could talk a little, especially because, you talked about people going back into their communities and being like, well, I don't know if I can even inhabit this space in the same way. And what the implications of that are as these substances get more introduced, and then also what you see as your position as a scientist and advocate, both on the medical and non-medical side. So I know one of the big opinions that we hear as scientists is you've got to be a scientist, don't be an advocate, don't take it yourself, all these sorts of things. How do you, embody that tension at this point in time? Is something I'd be curious about.
Well, so to answer the first piece of that, I'll answer with an anecdote. So one of the biggest risks, I think, of what happens when people have this insight or they have this realization and they don't act on it, one of the things in our depression trial that I found in working with those individuals is that for those of the people who did not kind of listen to that insight and kind of resisted change in the integration process, those were typically the folks that did not have long-lasting improvements in their mental health. In fact, one person in particular had a very clear kind of message during their experience that kind of highlighted for them not only that their occupation was inconsistent completely with what they wanted to be doing, but the environment was really kind of co-creating the space of emotional dysfunction in their life. And yet, that job was a very well-paying job that he did not feel like he could find other opportunities to have that level of income, not only for himself, but also for his partner and children. And he ultimately decided that even though he had this realization that was very powerful, he didn't feel like it was okay for him to put his family at risk financially in order to make that change. And unfortunately, within a couple of weeks, the depression started to creep back in, the anxiety actually increased greater than it was before the experience, because now he was anxious about knowing this information that he wasn't going to act on, and he couldn't unknow this information. And so anxiety actually got worse than it was before. And as a clinician and a researcher, there's only so much that we can do in that situation. You know, we can be encouraging, and I certainly tried to do what I could to help him work through that. But ultimately, he decided not to make that change. We just saw that person for their 6-month follow-up, and you know, still like depression and anxiety are very high, and he's still working in that environment. So, you know, obviously personal decision making needs to be a piece of that. You know, when you have these insights, it is, you know, a piece of the integration responsibility to find ways to work that into your life. But at the same time, we can't expect that to happen in our society if we don't have the support that people need to actually enact that change. And that's where I feel like we need to have more than just scientists and clinicians at the table. We need to have community members, families, and consumers at the table to try to figure out how are we going to change the system within which people are going back into. And I've completely forgotten your second question, but maybe I touched on it. What was the second?
You did touch on it.
Okay.
It's about scientists who work on this stuff medically, and then the way that this stuff is becoming so much more popular. Really, and you know, people are going to ask you, well, what should we be doing societally to handle this, given that it's going to be so much more available, and is already much more available than we have science to back up.
Yeah. So I recently had this conversation, or similar one, with Mary Castellano, who's been, she's a clinical social worker at Hopkins. She's been there for 25 years guiding psilocybin studies, and she was the one who trained me in the approach. And I asked her this question, and she turned to me and said, you need to do the same thing that we tell the people to do in their psilocybin session. You need to trust, and you need to let go, and you need to be open. You need to dive into things that are scary and that you don't have answers to, and you need to know that by going through that and going through this period of the development, that hopefully we will all come to a place of understanding, and we can fix some of these issues. But we have to dive into it. We can't sit on the sidelines. So whether or not we have it figured out, I think we all have a responsibility to dive in and to talk about it and to create conversation. Alicia Danforth talks about the psychedelic community right now as a group process, and that we're in the storming phase of our identity development as a group and a community, and that's okay. That's a critical piece of the group process. You know, if you're a clinician, it's a critical piece of the process for people to figure out who is where and who knows what, and who's going to have a conversation, and who's going to listen, and how are we going to share those identities and roles. It's actually a very healthy, adaptive piece of the process, even though it looks really challenging on the outside. So I would say just trust, dive in, be open, and we can do that together. Yeah.
So I'm a student studying at Lake Superior State University, and we have cannabis chemistry and cannabis business programs. One of the biggest problems that we've been facing is the fact that to get actual plant material on campus in labs for analysis puts our federal funding at risk because it's a Schedule I drug. And I was just wondering, from the Hopkins perspective, like, how do you guys get such good, I guess, how are you guys allowed to do such rigorous research and stuff? Because we haven't been able to get any sort of, I think the university itself is so afraid of losing all that federal funding that they don't want to take those and go after that research as much as the students do. So I guess from a student's perspective, how do you minimize the risk from a federal, like, disciplinary level to make it worth it for the university to do this sort of research?
Unfortunately, my answer is a pretty conservative one, which is really nothing happens at Hopkins that isn't approved by the Drug Enforcement Agency and the FDA. Without those two approvals to study those compounds, our university would not be okay with us doing that. So I don't know what the situation is at your university, but my guess is it's probably trying to conduct research in a way that maybe isn't going through the Drug Enforcement Agency, which makes sense because that process is a huge barrier, and there's a lot of problems with the types of plant matter that can come through that process anyway. But yeah, that's how we're able to do it, is because unfortunately we have found a path to both conform to the current system as well as to try to expand it from within, as opposed to changing the process from the outside. I'm not saying it's better, but that's how we've done it. Yeah.
Question. Like, I'm coming from a
social. Harm being done. Like, how have you navigated that? In perpetuating stigma, because I can imagine that that would perpetuate stigma in communities. Those kinds.
Yeah, I recently was contacted by a clinician who had something like this happen, where someone approached them to tell them that they wanted to. It was a mother who had heard about how had been research done with psychedelics, specifically MDMA, with autistic adults who had social anxiety, and so she wanted to give MDMA to her young child to try to help with their social anxiety. Now that brings up a whole host of questions. One. Is there now a duty, because this person is talking about giving an illegal drug to an underage person, also a vulnerable population outside of age because of their autism diagnosis, and it hasn't happened yet. So it's not talking about something that has happened that needs to be reported, because at this point it was just a hypothetical. They were just looking for information. Yeah, what do you do? I think it's really difficult. This person, my friend and colleague, was really struggling with, how to approach it in a way that was going to make sure their license was protected and safe, but also making sure that child was protected and safe, and not making it, in some ways, possibly making it worse by engaging in a process of reporting that maybe didn't necessarily need to happen if they could provide the right kind of information to this mother to explain perhaps why that was, not a good decision. I'm not suggesting that I know that it's not a good decision, but we certainly don't have the research yet to justify the safety of that, right? Certainly not in a home environment with an unknown drug and really the purity of that in question. I don't know if I'm answering your question or maybe just highlighting an example of how that's really a struggle, but I think leaning on kind of your instincts at that point to guide how would you respond to anybody in a situation where you have to balance the care and concern for a vulnerable person and population. And so ultimately, that clinician engaged in a series of conversations with that mother to explain the limits of current research on the topic and other avenues, tried to find resources for that person to connect to other avenues to find the help they needed for their child that didn't rely on doing something that was illegal. Did that answer your question-ish? Well, I think we have some food in the back for the break time, so please enjoy some refreshments, and we'll get started again at 4 o'clock.